The millionaire who, after being saved by a homeless man on a stormy night, discovered he was a forgotten war veteran and decided to change his life. The deafening crack of thunder shook the windows of the opulent high-rise apartment, startling Maxwell Rothschild from his brooding contemplation. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the tempest raging over the Chicago skyline. Lightning illuminated the angry clouds, casting eerie shadows across the city he had conquered. At 45, Maxwell had amassed a fortune that would make most men weep with envy. His tech company, Quantum Leap Industries, had revolutionized artificial intelligence, making him one of the wealthiest men in America. Yet as he stood there, tumbler of aged scotch in hand, he felt a hollowness that no amount of money could fill. The sudden chirping of his phone broke through the storm's cacophony. Maxwell glanced at the screen, seeing his assistant's name flash urgently. "What is it, Diane?" he answered, his voice clipped with irritation. "Mr. Rothschild, I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's been an emergency at the data center. The backup generators have failed, and we're at risk of losing critical research data." Maxwell pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling a headache forming. "How long until the systems crash?" "Less than an hour, sir. The tech team is scrambling, but they need executive authorization to implement the fail-safe protocol." "Damn it," Maxwell muttered. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have everything ready for my arrival." Without waiting for a response, he ended the call and downed the rest of his scotch in one burning gulp. He grabbed his coat and headed for the private elevator, his mind already racing through contingency plans. The storm seemed to intensify as Maxwell's sleek black Audi tore through the nearly deserted streets. Rain lashed against the windshield, and wind buffeted the vehicle, making it difficult to maintain control. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Suddenly, a figure darted into the road, illuminated by the headlights for just a fraction of a second. Maxwell's heart leaped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. The car fishtailed, spinning out of control. Time seemed to slow as the world tilted and spun around him. There was a sickening crunch of metal, and then darkness. Maxwell's eyes fluttered open, his head throbbing with each heartbeat. Raindrops pelted his face, and he realized he was lying on the cold, wet pavement. Disoriented, he tried to piece together what had happened. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" a gruff voice called out over the howling wind. Maxwell turned his head, wincing at the pain that shot through his neck. A bearded face swam into focus, weathered and lined with concern. The man was crouched beside him, shielding Maxwell from the worst of the rain with his own body. What happened?" Maxwell croaked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Your car hit a lamppost," the stranger explained, his eyes darting to assess Maxwell's condition. "You're lucky to be alive. Can you move your fingers and toes?" Maxwell complied, relief washing over him as he realized he still had full mobility. With the stranger's help, he slowly sat up, taking in the scene around him. His once pristine Audi was a crumpled wreck, steam hissing from the mangled hood. "We need to get you out of this rain," the man said, his voice tinged with urgency. "There's a shelter not far from here." "Think you can walk?" Maxwell nodded, though his entire body screamed in protest as the stranger helped him to his feet. It was then that he got a proper look at his rescuer. The man's clothes were ragged and soaked through, his beard unkempt. With a jolt, Maxwell realized he was being aided by a homeless man. "I'm Frank," the stranger said, as they began to make their slow, painful journey through the storm. "What's your name?" "Maxwell," he replied, leaning heavily on Frank for support. "Maxwell Rothschild." If Frank recognized the name, he gave no indication. Instead, he focused on guiding them safely through the treacherous streets, occasionally steadying Maxwell when he stumbled. As they walked, Maxwell's thoughts drifted to the data center crisis. His phone had been destroyed in the crash, leaving him with no way to contact Diane or his team. The realization that millions of dollars worth of research might be lost due to his absence filled him with a cold dread. "Almost there," Frank's voice cut through Maxwell's spiraling thoughts. They approached a nondescript building, its windows dark save for a faint glow from within. Frank rapped on the door in a specific pattern, and after a moment, it creaked open. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes ushered them inside. "Frank, we were worried sick about you in this weather. And who's this?" "This is Maxwell," Frank explained. "He had an accident, needs some patching up and a place to wait out the storm." The woman, who introduced herself as Maria, quickly set about tending to Maxwell's injuries. As she cleaned and bandaged a nasty cut on his forehead, Maxwell took in his surroundings. The shelter was sparse but clean, with rows of cots occupied by other souls seeking refuge from the tempest outside. "You're lucky Frank found you," Maria said softly. "He has a knack for being in the right place at the right time." Maxwell turned his gaze to Frank, who was wringing out his soaked jacket nearby. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what this man had done for him. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Frank shrugged, a hint of a smile visible beneath his beard. "Just doing what anyone would do." As Maria finished tending to his wounds, Maxwell found himself overcome with an unexpected wave of emotion. Here he was, one of the richest men in the country, being cared for by those who had so little. The irony was not lost on him. "Is there someone we can call for you?" Maria asked, handing Maxwell a steaming cup of tea. Maxwell shook his head, wincing at the movement. "My phone was destroyed in the crash. I don't remember any numbers by heart these days." Frank settled onto a nearby cot, his weathered face etched with curiosity. "So, Maxwell Rothschild, what's a guy like you doing out in a storm like this?" For a moment, Maxwell considered deflecting the question, but something about Frank's direct gaze made him pause. "There was an emergency at work. I was trying to get to the office to prevent a potential disaster." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "Must be some job to risk your life over." Maxwell let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that. I built my company from the ground up. It's my life's work." "And is it worth it?" Frank asked, his tone free of judgment. "Is it worth nearly dying for?" The question hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing he didn't have an answer. For the first time in years, Maxwell Rothschild found himself at a loss for words. As the storm continued to rage outside, Maxwell sat in contemplative silence, the warmth of the tea seeping into his hands. He couldn't shake the feeling that this night, this chance encounter, was about to change everything. Little did he know just how right he was. The storm's fury gradually subsided, leaving behind a quiet broken only by the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Maxwell sat on the edge of his cot, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The events of the night had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront questions he'd long avoided. Frank's words echoed in his head. "Is it worth it? Is it worth nearly dying for?" The truth was, Maxwell wasn't sure anymore. He'd spent so long chasing success, building his empire, that he'd lost sight of why he started in the first place. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the shelter's windows, Maxwell noticed Frank stirring from his makeshift bed. The older man stretched, wincing slightly as he worked out the kinks in his back. "Morning," Frank grunted, his voice gravelly from sleep. "How are you feeling?" Maxwell took stock of his body, noticing the dull ache in his muscles and the throbbing in his head. "I've been better," he admitted. "But I'm alive, thanks to you." Frank waved off the gratitude. "Don't mention it. You hungry? Maria usually whips up a mean breakfast for the early risers." As if on cue, the aroma of coffee and frying bacon wafted through the air. Maxwell's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. "That sounds great, actually," Maxwell said, surprised by his own eagerness. They made their way to a small kitchen area where Maria was bustling about, somehow managing to cook for a dozen people on a tiny stove. She greeted them with a warm smile, handing each a steaming mug of coffee. "Glad to see you up and about, Mr. Rothschild," she said. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Please, call me Maxwell," he insisted, taking a sip of the surprisingly good coffee. "And I'm doing much better thanks to your kindness." As they sat down to eat, Maxwell couldn't help but notice the easy camaraderie between Frank and the other shelter residents. There was a sense of community here that felt both foreign and oddly appealing to him. "So, Frank," Maxwell began, curiosity getting the better of him. "How did you end up here? If you don't mind me asking, that is." Frank set down his fork, a shadow passing over his face. "It's a long story, but I suppose we've got time." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Marine Corps. Came back home thinking I'd pick up where I left off, you know? But it wasn't that simple." Maxwell listened intently as Frank recounted his struggles with PTSD, the breakdown of his marriage, and the slow spiral that led to him losing everything. It was a story Maxwell had heard before in abstract terms, but hearing it from someone who had lived it made it painfully real. "I'm so sorry," Maxwell said, feeling woefully inadequate. "I had no idea." Frank shrugged, but there was no bitterness in his expression. "It is what it is. I'm not the only one with a story like that, but places like this," he gestured around the shelter, "they help, give us a chance to get back on our feet." As they finished breakfast, Maxwell's thoughts turned to his company and the crisis he had been racing to avert. "I hate to impose further," he said, "but is there a phone I could use? I need to contact my office." Maria pointed him to an old landline in the corner. With a sense of trepidation, Maxwell dialed Diane's number, one of the few he still knew by heart. "Quantum Leap Industries, this is Diane speaking." His assistant's voice came through, sounding stressed and exhausted. "Diane, it's Maxwell," he said quickly. "Mr. Rothschild," Diane exclaimed. "Oh, thank God. We've been trying to reach you all night. Where are you? What happened?" Maxwell briefly explained the accident and his current situation. "What's the status at the data center?" he asked, bracing himself for bad news. There was a pause before Diane responded. "Sir, we lost everything. The fail-safe protocols couldn't be implemented without your authorization. Years of research gone." The words hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He leaned against the wall, feeling dizzy. "Everything," he whispered. "I'm afraid so, sir. The board is in an uproar. They're calling for an emergency meeting this afternoon." Maxwell closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "All right. I'll be there. Send a car to pick me up." He gave Diane the shelter's address before hanging up. As he turned back to the room, Maxwell noticed Frank watching him with concern. "Bad news?" the older man asked. Maxwell nodded, slumping into a nearby chair. "The worst. My company. We just lost years of work. Millions of dollars in research, gone in an instant." Frank sat down across from him, his expression thoughtful. "That's a tough break," he said softly. "But you know what? You're still here. You survived. That's something." Maxwell looked up, meeting Frank's steady gaze. "I suppose you're right," he admitted. "It's just, I've put everything into this company. My time, my energy, my whole life. And now you've got a choice to make," Frank finished for him. "You can let this defeat you, or you can see it as an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Maxwell asked, skeptical. Frank nodded. "To reassess, to figure out what really matters to you. Sometimes, losing everything can be the best thing that ever happened to a person." Before Maxwell could respond, a sleek black car pulled up outside the shelter. His ride had arrived. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, Maxwell felt a strange reluctance. The world waiting for him outside seemed cold and unforgiving compared to the warmth he'd found in this unlikely place. "Frank," he said, turning to the man who had saved his life in more ways than one. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." Frank clasped his hand firmly. "You take care of yourself out there, Maxwell. And remember, there's more to life than the bottom line." With a final nod of gratitude to Maria and the others, Maxwell stepped out into the bright morning sun. As he settled into the back seat of the car, his mind was already racing, formulating plans and strategies for damage control. But beneath the familiar patterns of business thinking, a new seed had been planted, a question that wouldn't let him go. What if there was more to life than what he'd been chasing all these years? As the car pulled away from the curb, Maxwell found himself looking back at the unassuming building that had sheltered him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been irrevocably changed by his night among the forgotten and overlooked members of society. With a deep breath, he turned his attention to the challenges that lay ahead. The board meeting would be brutal, he knew. His leadership would be questioned, his decisions scrutinized. But for the first time in years, Maxwell felt a glimmer of something he'd almost forgotten. Perspective. Whatever happened in that boardroom, he realized it wouldn't be the end of the world. There were people out there facing far greater challenges with far fewer resources. People like Frank, who had lost everything and yet still found the strength to help others. As the Chicago skyline loomed before him, Maxwell made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would find a way to make things right, not just for his company, but for the people who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. The car turned onto Michigan Avenue, carrying Maxwell towards an uncertain future, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The world looked different now, viewed through the lens of his unexpected night of revelation. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, purpose, and the true meaning of wealth. The gleaming glass and steel facade of Quantum Leap Industries' headquarters loomed before Maxwell as his car pulled into the private underground parking. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the storm he was about to face. The familiar surroundings felt oddly foreign after his night at the shelter, as if he were seeing his carefully constructed world through new eyes. As Maxwell stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, he was immediately accosted by his CFO, Victoria Hartley. Her usually immaculate appearance was marred by dark circles under her eyes and a slightly askew blazer. "Maxwell, thank God you're here," she said, falling into step beside him. "The vultures are circling. Half the board is calling for your head on a platter." Maxwell nodded grimly. "I expected as much. What's our current status?" Victoria handed him a tablet with the latest reports. "It's not good. We've lost an estimated $50 million in research and development. Our stock is in free fall, and our major investors are threatening to pull out." They reached Maxwell's office, where Diane was waiting with a fresh suit and a grim expression. "Mr. Rothschild, the board is assembled in the main conference room. They're not happy." "Are they ever?" Maxwell muttered, quickly changing into the crisp new suit. As he knotted his tie, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. The cut on his forehead from the accident was a stark reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. Or had he gained something instead? Shaking off the philosophical musing, Maxwell strode towards the conference room, Victoria and Diane flanking him like generals preparing for battle. As he pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, the heated conversation within abruptly ceased. 12 pairs of eyes turned to him, a mixture of anger, disappointment, and thinly veiled opportunism evident in their gazes. At the head of the table sat Gerald Blackwood, the lead investor and most vocal critic of Maxwell's leadership. "Well, well," Gerald drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So kind of you to join us, Maxwell. I trust your little joyride was worth jeopardizing the entire company." Maxwell felt a flash of anger at the insinuation, but forced himself to remain calm. "I assure you, Gerald, there was nothing joyous about last night's events. Now, shall we discuss how we're going to move forward?" For the next 2 hours, Maxwell found himself in the fight of his professional life. He presented plans for recovery, outlined strategies for rebuilding their lost research, and promised to personally oversee the implementation of new safeguards to prevent future disasters. But with each proposal, he was met with skepticism and hostility. The board members, sensing blood in the water, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. "Face it, Rothschild," sneered Eliza Conroy, another major shareholder. "This disaster happened on your watch. How can we trust you to lead us out of it?" Maxwell opened his mouth to defend himself, but suddenly found he lacked the words. In the past, he would have countered with a blistering retort, leveraging his charisma and track record to cow his opposition into submission. But now he felt a strange reluctance to fall back on his old tactics. In the momentary silence, Maxwell's mind flashed back to the shelter. He thought of Frank, a man who had lost everything yet still found the strength to help others. He thought of Maria, working tirelessly to provide a safe haven for those society had forgotten. And in that moment, something shifted within Maxwell Rothschild. "You're right," he said quietly, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "This disaster happened on my watch, and I take full responsibility for it." A stunned silence fell over the boardroom. Maxwell took a deep breath and continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "But let me ask you this. When was the last time any of us truly considered the impact of our work beyond the bottom line? We've been so focused on pushing the boundaries of AI that we've lost sight of why we started this company in the first place." He stood up, pacing slowly around the table as he spoke. "Last night, I had an experience that opened my eyes. I saw firsthand the struggles of people who have been left behind by the very technology we're developing, and it made me realize that we have an obligation, not just to our shareholders, but to society as a whole." Gerald scoffed. "What are you suggesting, Maxwell, that we turn Quantum Leap into a charity?" "No," Maxwell replied firmly. "I'm suggesting we become something greater. What if we redirected some of our resources towards developing AI solutions for social good? Imagine the impact we could have on healthcare, education, and social services." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, some intrigued, others outraged. Maxwell raised his hand, calling for silence. "I'm not asking for blind faith," he said. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that we can be both profitable and socially responsible. Give me 6 months. If I can't turn this company around and show concrete progress on these new initiatives, I'll step down voluntarily." A tense silence fell over the room as the board members exchanged glances. Finally, Gerald spoke up. "And how do you propose to fund these altruistic endeavors? Our investors aren't going to be thrilled about diverting resources from our core business." Maxwell met Gerald's gaze steadily. "I'll put up 10 million of my own money to start, and I'll take a 50% pay cut until we're back in the black." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Victoria shot Maxwell a look of disbelief, but he ignored it, focusing on the faces around the table. He could see the wheels turning in their minds, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. After what felt like an eternity, Gerald leaned back in his chair. "You're either a genius or a madman, Rothschild, but I've got to admit, you've piqued my interest. All right, you've got your 6 months, but if this goes south, it's not just your job on the line, it's the entire company." As the meeting adjourned, Maxwell felt a curious mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He'd just bet his entire career on a vision inspired by a chance encounter with a homeless veteran. The rational part of his mind was screaming that he'd lost his senses, but in his heart, he knew he was on the right path. Victoria cornered him as he left the conference room. "Maxwell, have you lost your mind?" she hissed. "We're barely keeping our heads above water as it is. How are we supposed to take on these new social good projects?" Maxwell placed a hand on her shoulder, surprised to find himself smiling. "Victoria, I know it sounds crazy, but I truly believe this is our chance to make a real difference. Will you trust me on this?" She studied his face for a long moment before sighing in resignation. "I must be as crazy as you are, but all right, I'm in. Where do we start?" "First," Maxwell said, his mind already racing with possibilities, "I need you to set up a meeting with our RD team. And then, I think it's time we paid a visit to a certain shelter." As they walked back to his office, Maxwell felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, fraught with obstacles and uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Little did he know, his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform Quantum Leap Industries, but would have far-reaching consequences for the lives of those he'd met in that humble shelter, especially Frank, the man who had unknowingly sparked this revolution. As the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, Maxwell Rothschild stood at his office window, gazing out at the world he was now determined to change. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity at Quantum Leap Industries. Maxwell Rothschild, reinvigorated by his new sense of purpose, threw himself into the task of reimagining his company's future. The once pristine walls of his office were now covered in whiteboards filled with ideas, flowcharts, and hastily scribbled notes. On this particular morning, Maxwell stood before his team in the main conference room, the energy palpable as he outlined his vision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with conviction, "we have a unique opportunity before us. We're not just going to rebuild what we lost. We're going to create something greater, something that can change lives." He clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of proposed projects. Project Horizon will focus on developing AI-assisted healthcare solutions for underserved communities. Project Lighthouse aims to create adaptive learning systems for students with special needs. And Project Bridge, well, that's where things get really interesting. Maxwell paused, looking around the room. Some faces showed excitement, others skepticism. He took a deep breath before continuing. "Project Bridge is our most ambitious undertaking yet. We're going to develop an AI-driven platform to connect homeless veterans with resources, job opportunities, and support networks. And to ensure we're addressing real needs, we're partnering with local shelters to get direct input from the people we're trying to help." A hand shot up in the back of the room. It belonged to Dr. Samantha Chen, one of their top AI researchers. "Mr. Rothschild, while these projects sound admirable, how do they align with our core business model, our investors?" "Our investors," Maxwell interrupted gently, "have given us 6 months to prove that we can be both profitable and socially responsible. I believe these projects will not only generate positive PR, but also open up new markets and funding opportunities we've never considered before." He clicked to the next slide, showing projected financials. "Yes, there will be initial costs, but look at the potential long-term gains, government contracts, partnerships with NGOs, not to mention the tax benefits of our increased charitable work." As the meeting concluded, Maxwell could feel a shift in the room's energy. The initial skepticism was giving way to cautious optimism. People were starting to believe in the possibility of what they could achieve. Later that afternoon, Maxwell found himself standing once again outside the shelter where his journey had begun. He hesitated for a moment, straightening his tie nervously. This wasn't a boardroom or a tech conference. This was real life, with real stakes. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The familiar scent of coffee and cleaning supplies greeted him as he stepped inside. Maria looked up from the reception desk, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Rothschild, what a surprise," she exclaimed, coming around to greet him. "Is everything all right?" Maxwell smiled warmly. "Please, Maria, I told you to call me Maxwell. And yes, everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. Is Frank around? I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with both of you." Maria's expression turned curious. "He's just finishing up a group session." "Come on, I'll take you to him." As they walked through the shelter, Maxwell took in the details he'd missed during his first visit, the worn but clean furnishings, the motivational posters on the walls, the small library of donated books. It was a place of hope, he realized, built on the dedication of people like Maria and Frank. They found Frank in a small meeting room, saying goodbye to a group of veterans. His face lit up with surprise when he saw Maxwell. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Frank said with a grin. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon. Everything okay?" Maxwell nodded, suddenly feeling a bit nervous. "More than okay, actually. I have an idea I wanted to run by you both. Do you have a moment?" Over the next hour, Maxwell laid out his vision for Project Bridge. He explained how Quantum Leap's AI technology could be adapted to create a comprehensive support system for homeless veterans, connecting them with resources, job opportunities, and mental health support. "The thing is," Maxwell concluded, "we need your expertise to make this work. Frank, your experience as a veteran and your work here at the shelter, it's invaluable. And Maria, your understanding of the day-to-day challenges these men and women face. We need that insight." Frank and Maria exchanged a look, a mix of excitement and caution in their eyes. "It sounds amazing, Maxwell," Maria said slowly. "But how would this actually work? We're just a small shelter. We don't know anything about AI or big business." Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "That's exactly why we need you. You know the human side of this equation. We're proposing a partnership. We provide the technology and resources. You provide the expertise and on-the-ground knowledge. Together, we can create something that could change lives across the country." Frank scratched his beard thoughtfully. "And what's in it for you, Maxwell? No offense, but I've seen too many big shots come through here with grand plans that never pan out." Maxwell met Frank's gaze steadily. "Fair question. Honestly, this is about redemption for me. That night you saved me. It opened my eyes. I've spent years chasing profits and innovation without really thinking about the impact of my work. This is my chance to use what I've built for something greater." A moment of silence fell over the room as Frank and Maria considered his words. Finally, Frank spoke up. "All right, Maxwell, I can't speak for Maria, but I'm willing to give this a shot, on one condition." "Name it," Maxwell said without hesitation. Frank's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "You've got to volunteer here at the shelter. Once a week, no excuses. If we're going to be partners, you need to really understand what we do here." Maxwell blinked in surprise, then broke into a genuine laugh. "Deal," he said, extending his hand to Frank. As they shook on it, Maxwell felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he was meant to be. As he left the shelter that evening, plans already forming in his mind, Maxwell's phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Gerald's making noise about pulling his investment. We need a plan." Maxwell felt a flicker of anxiety, but it was quickly replaced by determination. He had known there would be obstacles. This was just the first of many. Stepping into his car, he began dictating emails and making calls. There was work to be done, bridges to be built, and lives to be changed. And for the first time in years, Maxwell Rothschild was ready for the challenge. As the Chicago skyline faded into the rearview mirror, Maxwell allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer walking it alone. With allies like Frank and Maria by his side, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. Little did he know, the true test of his newfound resolve was just around the corner, waiting to shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about business, philanthropy, and the thin line between success and failure in the cutthroat world of tech innovation. The early morning sun had barely begun to paint the Chicago skyline when Maxwell Rothschild strode into Quantum Leap Industries' headquarters. The tension in the air was palpable as he made his way to the boardroom, nodding curtly to the anxious employees he passed. Victoria was waiting for him outside the boardroom doors, her face a mask of professional concern. "They're all inside," she murmured. "Gerald's on the warpath. Are you sure about this, Maxwell?" Maxwell straightened his tie, a determined glint in his eye. "We knew there would be resistance, Victoria. Here it's time to show them what we're made of." As they entered, the buzz of tense conversation abruptly ceased. Gerald Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his face thunderous. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. "Well, well," Gerald drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So nice of you to join us, Maxwell. Care to explain why you're throwing away millions on feel-good projects while our stock price continues to plummet?" Maxwell took his seat calmly, meeting Gerald's gaze. "I'd be happy to, Gerald. But first, I'd like to present some numbers of my own." He nodded to Victoria, who distributed a set of reports to the board members. "What you're looking at," Maxwell explained, "is a projection of potential government contracts and grants available for AI-driven social impact projects. The total value, over $500 million in the next fiscal year alone." A murmur of interest rippled through the room. Even Gerald looked momentarily taken aback. "Furthermore," Maxwell continued, clicking through a series of slides on the main screen, "our PR team reports a 200% increase in positive media coverage since announcing our new initiatives. We've seen a surge in job applications from top talent in the industry, all citing our commitment to social responsibility as a major draw." He paused, letting the information sink in. "Yes, our stock price has taken a hit, but that's a short-term reaction to a long-term strategy. We're not just building products anymore, we're building a legacy. Gerald's face had turned an alarming shade of red. A legacy, he sputtered. We're not a charity, Rothschild. We're a business, and right now, you're running it into the ground with these pipe dreams. Maxwell leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Tell me, Gerald, what do you think our AI technology is truly capable of? Do you even understand the potential we're sitting on? He stood up, pacing the room as he spoke. We have the power to revolutionize healthcare, education, social services, to create systems that can predict and prevent crises before they happen. And yes, to help those who've been left behind by society. That's not charity. That's innovation. That's progress. The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances. Maxwell could see the conflict in their eyes, the allure of potential profits warring with the fear of the unknown. Finally, Eliza Conroy, one of the more sympathetic board members, spoke up. It's an admirable vision, Maxwell, but the risks are considerable, Maxwell finished for her. I know. That's why I'm putting my money where my mouth is. He turned to face Gerald directly. You want to pull your investment? Fine. I'll buy you out. Every last share. A collective gasp went through the room. Gerald's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. You don't have that kind of liquid capital. Maxwell smiled thinly. Try me. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down. Then, abruptly, Gerald stood up. This isn't over, Rothschild, he growled, storming out of the room. As the door slammed behind him, Maxwell felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But there was no time to rest. He had a company to run and a vision to fulfill. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. It was late evening by the time Maxwell finally left the office, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. As he drove through the city, he found himself taking a detour. Before he knew it, he was pulling up outside the shelter. The place was quiet at this hour, most of the residents already settled in for the night. Maxwell found Frank in the small office at the back, poring over a stack of paperwork. Frank looked up in surprise. Maxwell, what are you doing here so late? Maxwell sank into a chair, suddenly feeling the weight of the day. Honestly, I'm not sure. It's been a challenging day. Frank's expression softened. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a bottle and 2 paper cups. Sounds like you could use this, he said, pouring a generous measure of amber liquid into each cup. Maxwell accepted the drink gratefully, taking a long sip. The whiskey burned going down, but it helped to calm his frayed nerves. Want to talk about it? Frank asked, leaning back in his chair. Maxwell found himself pouring out the events of the day, the board meeting, Gerald's threats, the enormous gamble he was taking with his own fortune. Frank listened quietly, nodding occasionally. When Maxwell finished, he was silent for a long moment. You know, Frank said finally, when I was in Afghanistan, we had a saying. The only easy day was yesterday. Sounds to me like you're in the thick of it now, son. But you're fighting the good fight, Maxwell smiled wryly. It doesn't feel like it sometimes. There are moments when I wonder if I'm just being naive, thinking I can change things. Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. Let me tell you something, Maxwell. I've seen a lot of people come through those doors out there. Good people who've hit rock bottom. And you know what makes the difference between those who make it and those who don't. It's not money or luck or even skill, it's purpose. He gestured towards the shelter beyond the office walls. What you're doing with your company, that gives people purpose, hope, a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. Don't ever underestimate the power of that. Maxwell felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized was there. Thank you, Frank, he said quietly. I needed to hear that. As he left the shelter that night, Maxwell felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but he was on the right path. Of that, he was certain. Driving home through the quiet streets of Chicago, Maxwell's mind was already racing with new ideas. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start putting together a team for Project Bridge. It was time to turn vision into reality. Little did he know, the events set in motion that day would soon catapult him and Quantum Leap Industries into the national spotlight, bringing both unprecedented opportunities and dangers he could never have foreseen. As the city lights twinkled around him, Maxwell Rothschild smiled to himself. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it head-on. The bustling energy of Quantum Leap Industries, newly established Project Bridge headquarters, was a stark contrast to the sterile corporate environment of just a few months ago. The open-plan office buzzed with activity as developers, social workers, and veterans worked side by side, their diverse backgrounds united by a common purpose. Maxwell Rothschild stood at the center of it all, his sleeves rolled up as he examined a holographic display of their AI interface. Beside him, Frank peered at the swirling data points with a mixture of awe and confusion. "You're telling me this thing can predict when a vet might be at risk of homelessness?" Frank asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Maxwell nodded, his eyes alight with excitement. "That's just the beginning, Frank. By analyzing patterns in employment history, medical records, and social services interactions, we can identify at-risk individuals before they hit crisis point. Then we can proactively connect them with the resources they need." Frank shook his head in amazement. "When I first met you, I never would have pegged you for a tech wizard with a heart of gold." Maxwell chuckled, but before he could respond, Victoria approached with a tablet in hand and a worried expression on her face. "Maxwell, we have a problem," she said, her voice low. "The data protection watchdogs are sniffing around. They're concerned about the amount of personal information we're processing." Maxwell's brow furrowed. "We're fully compliant with all privacy regulations. What's their issue?" Victoria sighed. "It's not just about legality. There's a growing public concern about AI systems having access to such sensitive data. Some veterans groups are calling it digital surveillance of vulnerable populations." The news hit Maxwell like a punch to the gut. They'd worked so hard to build trust within the veteran community. The last thing he wanted was for Project Bridge to be seen as an invasion of privacy. "All right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Set up a meeting with our legal team and PR department. We need to get ahead of this." As Victoria hurried off, Frank placed a hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy, son, but you're doing the right thing. Don't forget that." Maxwell nodded gratefully, but the weight of the challenge ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. Over the next few weeks, Maxwell found himself caught in a whirlwind of damage control. He gave interviews, met with veteran advocacy groups, and even testified before a congressional committee on AI ethics and privacy rights. It was after one particularly grueling day of meetings that Maxwell found himself once again at the shelter, seeking the grounding presence of Frank and Maria. "I don't get it," Maxwell sighed, slumping into a chair in the shelter's small kitchen. "We're trying to help people. Why is there so much resistance?" Maria set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. "Change is scary, Maxwell, especially for people who've been let down by the system before." Frank nodded in agreement. "Plus, you're dealing with a lot of pride here. Veterans don't want to feel like they're being monitored or pitied." Maxwell took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his tired bones. "So what do we do? How do we show them that this isn't about surveillance or pity, but about empowerment?" A thoughtful silence fell over the room. Then slowly, a smile spread across Frank's face. "I think I might have an idea," he said. The next day, Maxwell found himself standing before a group of skeptical veterans at the local VA hospital. Frank stood beside him, a reassuring presence in the face of the wary gazes directed their way. "Gentlemen," Frank began, his voice carrying the weight of shared experience, "I know you've been hearing a lot about this Project Bridge thing, and I get it. You're wondering why you should trust some fancy AI system with your personal information." He paused, looking around the room. "But let me tell you something. I've seen what this technology can do. It's not about spying on you or treating you like a charity case. It's about giving you the tools to take control of your own life." Frank gestured to Maxwell. "This man here, he could be sitting pretty in his corner office, counting his millions. Instead, he's putting everything on the line to make sure guys like us don't fall through the cracks." Maxwell stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "Frank's right," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Project Bridge isn't about handouts. It's about creating a support network that understands what you're going through and can connect you with the right resources at the right time. He took a deep breath before continuing. "Yeah, but here's the thing. We can't do it without you. We need your input, your experiences to make this system work, to make sure it's serving you, not the other way around." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, slowly, hands began to raise. Questions were asked, concerns voiced, but there was a shift in the energy of the room. Where there had been suspicion, now there was cautious interest. As the session wound down, one veteran approached Maxwell, his expression thoughtful. "You really believe in this, don't you?" he asked. Maxwell met his gaze steadily. "With every fiber of my being," he replied. The veteran nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'm willing to give it a shot. Where do I sign up?" That night, as Maxwell drove home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. There were still challenges ahead, the privacy concerns, the technological hurdles, the ever-present pressure from investors. But they were making progress, one veteran at a time. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Great news. The New York Times wants to do a feature on Project Bridge. This could be huge for us." Maxwell smiled to himself. It was a small victory, but an important one. They were starting to turn the tide of public opinion. As he pulled into his driveway, Maxwell's mind was already racing with plans for the next phase of the project. They needed to scale up, to reach more veterans across the country. And to do that, they'd need more funding, more partnerships. He thought back to the skeptical veteran at the VA hospital, the moment of connection they'd shared. That was what it was all about. Not the technology, not the accolades, but the lives they were changing. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Maxwell felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. There were still mountains to climb, but for the first time, he truly believed they could reach the summit. Little did he know, the biggest challenge of his career and his newfound mission was just around the corner, waiting to test everything he thought he knew about business, philanthropy, and the true cost of change. The New York Times feature on Project Bridge hit newsstands on a crisp autumn morning, sending shockwaves through the tech industry and beyond. Maxwell Rothschild's face stared out from the cover of the business section, alongside the bold headline, "The Billionaire's Redemption: How One Tech Mogul is Revolutionizing Veteran Care." As Maxwell walked into Quantum Leap's headquarters that morning, he was greeted by a round of applause from his employees. The atmosphere was electric, a palpable sense of pride and purpose filling the air. But amid the celebrations, Maxwell couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. He'd been in the business long enough to know that being in the spotlight came with its own set of risks. His instincts proved correct when Victoria burst into his office less than an hour later, her face pale with worry. "Maxwell, we have a situation," she said, her voice tight. "Someone's launched a cyber attack on our servers. They're targeting Project Bridge's database." Maxwell felt his blood run cold. "How bad is it?" Victoria shook her head. "We're not sure yet. Our security team is working on it, but—" She hesitated. "There's more. We've traced the attack. It's coming from inside Quantum Leap." The revelation hit Maxwell like a physical blow, an inside job. Someone within his own company was trying to sabotage Project Bridge. The implications were staggering. "Lock down the building," Maxwell ordered, his mind racing. "No one leaves until we get to the bottom of this, and get me Frank on the phone. We need to warn the veterans in the program." The next few hours were a blur of crisis management. Maxwell worked alongside his cybersecurity team, trying to repel the attack while simultaneously tracing its source. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, as employees were questioned and systems were scrutinized. It was late in the evening when they finally identified the culprit. Maxwell stood in shock as security escorted Dr. Samantha Chen, one of their top AI researchers, out of the building in handcuffs. "Why, Samantha?" Maxwell asked, his voice heavy with disbelief and betrayal. "Why would you do this?" Samantha's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and fear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Maxwell," she hissed. "This technology, it's too powerful. In the wrong hands, It could be used to control people, not help them. I couldn't let that happen. As she was led away, Maxwell felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He'd thought the hardest part would be convincing people of the value of Project Bridge. He never imagined he'd have to defend it against threats from within. The following days were a maelstrom of damage control. Maxwell found himself juggling press conferences, meetings with worried investors, and long sessions with his legal team. The attack had been stopped before any sensitive data was compromised, but the news of the breach had leaked to the media, sparking a fresh wave of privacy concerns. It was in the midst of this chaos that Maxwell received an unexpected call from Frank. "You need to come down to the shelter," Frank said, his voice urgent. "There's someone here you need to meet." Intrigued and grateful for any excuse to escape the pressure cooker of his office, Maxwell made his way to the shelter. He found Frank waiting for him outside, a grim expression on his weathered face. "What's going on, Frank?" Maxwell asked as they walked inside. "You'll see," Frank replied cryptically, leading him to a small meeting room. Inside, Maxwell found himself face to face with a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. The man's haunted eyes and nervous demeanor spoke volumes about the struggles he'd faced. "Maxwell, this is Alex," Frank introduced them. "Alex, tell him what you told me." Alex took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Rothschild, I think I might be responsible for what happened at your company." Maxwell felt his jaw drop. "What do you mean?" Alex's story tumbled out in a rush. He was a veteran who had been part of the Project Bridge pilot program. Struggling with PTSD and feeling desperate, he had been approached by a group claiming to be advocates for veterans' rights. They had convinced him that Project Bridge was a threat, a tool for surveillance and control. They had used him to gain inside information, which they had then passed on to Dr. Chen. "I didn't know what they were really planning," Alex finished, his voice breaking. "I thought I was protecting my fellow vets, but when I saw the news about the cyber attack, I realized I'd been used." Maxwell listened in stunned silence, his mind reeling from the implications. This wasn't just about corporate espionage or privacy concerns. There were larger forces at play, actively working to undermine Project Bridge. As he left the shelter that night, Maxwell felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had started this journey thinking he could change the world through technology and good intentions. Now he was beginning to realize the true complexity of the challenge he had undertaken. Back at his office, Maxwell found Victoria waiting for him, a stack of reports in her hand. "The board is calling for an emergency meeting," she said softly. "They're spooked by the security breach. Some of them are talking about shutting down Project Bridge altogether." Maxwell nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm descend over him. "Set up the meeting," he said. "But first I need you to do something for me." "Anything," Victoria replied. "I need you to find out everything you can about these so-called veterans, rights groups. Something tells me we're dealing with more than just concerned citizens." As Victoria hurried off to comply, Maxwell turned to look out over the Chicago skyline. The city lights twinkled below, a reminder of the countless lives that could be impacted by the success or failure of Project Bridge. He thought of Alex, of the veterans he'd met who were cautiously putting their trust in this program. He thought of Frank and Maria working tirelessly at the shelter. And he thought of Samantha Chen, so convinced of the dangers that she was willing to risk everything to stop the project. In that moment, Maxwell Rothschild made a decision. He had come too far, touched too many lives, to back down now. Whatever forces were aligning against Project Bridge, he would face them head-on. As he turned back to his desk, ready to prepare for the fight of his life, Maxwell felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was far from over, but he was determined to see it through. Little did he know the true test of his resolve and the ultimate fate of Project Bridge was yet to come. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned cold and grey, a fitting backdrop for the battle Maxwell Rothschild knew lay ahead. As he straightened his tie and took one last look in the mirror, he couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind journey that had led him to this moment. Just months ago, he had been a different man, driven by profit and prestige, blind to the real impact his work could have. Now, he stood on the precipice of either his greatest triumph or his most spectacular failure, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. As Maxwell strode into the boardroom, he could feel the tension thick in the air. The faces around the table were a mix of concern, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. At the far end sat Gerald Blackwood, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Maxwell," Gerald drawled as the room fell silent, "I hope you're prepared to explain how you've managed to turn our company into a target for cyber-terrorists and conspiracy theorists." Maxwell took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Before I address recent events," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I'd like to show you something." He nodded to Victoria, who dimmed the lights and started a video projection. The screen filled with faces, dozens of veterans whose lives had been touched by Project Bridge. One by one, they shared their stories, jobs found, homes secured, lives rebuilt. As the last testimony faded, Maxwell turned back to the board. "This Marsan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what we're fighting for. Yes, we've faced setbacks. Yes, there are those who would see us fail. But the impact we're having, the lives we're changing, that's real." He paused, looking each board member in the eye. "Now, let me tell you what we've uncovered about the forces aligned against us." Over the next hour, Maxwell laid out the results of their investigation. The veterans' rights groups that had manipulated Alex were, in fact, fronts for a consortium of private military contractors. These companies stood to lose billions if Project Bridge succeeded in reintegrating veterans into civilian life, reducing the pool of desperate ex-soldiers willing to take high-risk jobs overseas. "They see our work as a threat to their bottom line," Maxwell explained, his voice hard with anger. "They're willing to exploit the very people they claim to champion, all to protect their profits." A murmur of disbelief and outrage rippled through the room. Even Gerald looked shaken by the revelation. "But that's not all," Maxwell continued. He clicked to the next slide, revealing a familiar face. Dr. Samantha Chen, the researcher behind the cyber attack, she wasn't working alone. Another click, and a series of email exchanges appeared on the screen. They showed correspondence between Dr. Chen and none other than Gerald Blackwood himself. The room erupted into chaos. Gerald leapt to his feet, face red with fury. "This is preposterous," he shouted. "You can't possibly expect anyone to believe these fabrications." "They're not fabrications, Gerald," Maxwell said calmly. "They're the result of a thorough investigation by our cybersecurity team, verified by an independent third party. You've been working with our competitors to sabotage Project Bridge from the inside." As security escorted a sputtering Gerald from the room, Maxwell turned back to the remaining board members. "I know I've asked a lot of you," he said softly. "I've pushed this company in a direction that many of you weren't comfortable with, but I'm asking you now to trust me, to believe in the vision of what we can accomplish." He clicked to one final slide, a projection of Project Bridge's potential impact over the next 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of veterans reintegrated into society, billions saved in social services costs, and a projected profit that dwarfed their previous business model. "This isn't just about doing good," Maxwell concluded. "It's about redefining what a tech company can be in the 21st century. It's about leading the way into a future where profit and social responsibility go hand in hand." As Maxwell finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the room. He held his breath, waiting for the response that would determine the fate of everything he'd fought for. Then, slowly, one of the board members began to clap. Another joined in, and another, until the room filled with applause. Eliza Conroy, the board member who had initially been skeptical of Maxwell's vision, stood up. "I think I speak for all of us," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "when I say that we're behind you, Maxwell. 100%. Let's show the world what Quantum Leap can really do." The wave of relief and joy that washed over Maxwell was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. As the meeting adjourned and congratulations poured in, he found a quiet moment to slip away, pulling out his phone to make a call. "Frank," he said when the other man picked up, "we did it. The board's fully on board. Project Bridge is full steam ahead." Frank's gruff chuckle came through the line. "Never doubted you for a second, son. Now the real work begins." Maxwell smiled, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. "Meet me at the shelter in an hour," he said. We've got a lot to discuss." An hour later, Maxwell walked into the shelter, greeted by the familiar scents of coffee and hope. Frank and Maria were waiting for him, along with a group of veterans he recognized from the Project Bridge pilot program. Among them stood Alex, looking nervous but determined. "Gentlemen," Maxwell said, addressing the group, "we've won an important battle, but the war is far from over. We're going to scale up Project Bridge, take it nationwide, but to do that we need your help." He outlined his plan to create a veteran advisory board, giving those who had served a direct say in the development and implementation of the AI system. He wanted their experiences, their insights, to be at the heart of everything they did. As he spoke, Maxwell could see the change in their faces, the spark of purpose, of being part of something greater than themselves. This, he realized, was the true power of Project Bridge, not just the technology, but the community it was building. Later that evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Maxwell stood on the roof of Quantum Leap headquarters with Victoria, Frank, and Maria. They looked out over the city, each lost in thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment and the challenges that lay ahead. "You know," Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when you first walked into that shelter, I never would have guessed we'd end up here." Maxwell chuckled. "Neither did I, Frank, neither did I." Maria smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You've started something amazing, Maxwell. Something that's going to change so many lives." "We've started something amazing," Maxwell corrected her gently. "All of us together." As they stood there, watching the city lights come to life, Maxwell felt a profound sense of peace. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, scaling the project, fighting against those who opposed them, continuing to balance profit with purpose. But for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The journey had changed him, stripped away the trappings of his old life, and revealed a purpose he never knew he had. As he looked at the faces of his friends, his partners in this grand endeavor, Maxwell Rothschild knew that this was just the beginning. The story of Project Bridge, and the lives it would touch, was only just beginning to unfold. And whatever came next, they would face it together, building bridges of hope and opportunity, one life at a time.